In October 2019, the quiet coastal city of Cape Coral, Florida, became the setting for a crime that would leave a community struggling to understand how such violence could unfold in a single ordinary day. The man at the center of it all was Wade Wilson, a drifter whose life appeared scattered and untethered long before his name ever appeared in a courtroom. To those who briefly crossed paths with him, he often seemed charismatic and confident, someone who understood how to present himself in a way that drew attention. Yet beneath that surface was a life marked by instability, addiction, and a pattern of drifting from place to place, without roots or lasting responsibility. Wilson had no stable career, no long-term plans, and very little connection to the structures that typically anchor a person's life. Friends and acquaintances would later describe him as someone who could be charming in conversation, but distant in emotion, as if he were merely performing the role of an engaged participant in the world, while remaining detached from it internally. At the same time, the lives of the women who would become his victims followed a very different path. Kristine Melton was known by those around her as a warm and outgoing person who valued connection and friendship. She had built a life that reflected stability and openness, someone who believed people deserved kindness until proven otherwise. On the day she encountered Wilson, she had no reason to imagine she was stepping into danger. Their meeting appeared casual, the type of interaction that happens countless times in social spaces across the country. What began as a seemingly ordinary encounter would soon become the first step in a sequence of events that investigators would later describe as calculated and deeply disturbing. According to investigators, Wilson eventually went to Melton's home during the night. Inside that home, the situation turned deadly. Prosecutors later explained that Wilson strangled Melton, ending her life in a moment of deliberate violence that shocked even experienced detectives once the details surfaced. But the tragedy did not end there. In the hours that followed, Wilson left the scene driving Melton's vehicle, moving through Cape Coral as if nothing had happened. It was during this time that he encountered Diane Ruiz, a mother known for her reliability and dedication to her family. Ruiz was simply walking to work early that morning, following a routine that countless people rely on every day. What happened next would cement the case as one of the most disturbing crimes the region had seen in years. Ruiz was forced into the vehicle Wilson had taken from Melton. Investigators later determined that she was also strangled during the encounter. When Wilson realized she was still alive, prosecutors said he made a decision that would horrify the courtroom once it was revealed. He ran over Ruiz with the car, killing her in an act that investigators described as deliberate and methodical rather than impulsive. Within less than 24 hours, two women with entirely separate lives had been murdered, their futures abruptly erased by someone who seemed to operate without any visible sense of empathy or restraint. The brutality of the crimes contrasted sharply with the quiet routine of the community where they occurred. Cape Coral was not a place known for violence on this scale. Residents followed the investigation closely as law enforcement began piecing together the timeline. Detectives quickly realized they were not dealing with a complex criminal mastermind trying to hide his tracks. Instead, the evidence suggested something far more unsettling, a man who appeared largely unconcerned about whether he would eventually be caught. As investigators worked to understand Wilson's movements and statements in the hours after the killings, a troubling portrait began to emerge. Rather than panic or desperation, there was an unsettling calm surrounding his behavior. It was as if the crimes were simply another step in a life that had already drifted far away from ordinary moral boundaries. For the families of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, the reality was devastating. Two women who had spent their lives building relationships, responsibilities, and futures had become the victims of a man who seemed to move through the world without any of those anchors. By the time law enforcement began closing in on Wilson, the case had already left an emotional fracture running through the community. The investigation would soon move from the streets of Cape Coral into interrogation rooms and eventually the courtroom, where prosecutors would attempt to answer the most pressing question left behind by the violence. Not simply who committed the crimes, but why someone could carry out such acts with such apparent detachment. The answers that emerged would only deepen the unsettling nature of the case. As the investigation moved from the streets of Cape Coral into the formal structure of the justice system, prosecutors began assembling the evidence that would eventually define the legal case against Wade Wilson. The charges filed in Lee County, Florida, reflected the full scope of what investigators believed had happened on that October day in 2019. Wilson was formally accused of the first-degree murder of Kristine Melton and the first-degree murder of Diane Ruiz. Alongside those charges were additional counts, including grand theft of a motor vehicle, burglary of a dwelling, battery, and petty theft. Each charge corresponded to a specific moment investigators believed they could prove through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Wilson's own statements. Crime scene investigators quickly tied Wilson to Kristine Melton's home through physical evidence recovered during the forensic examination. DNA collected from materials surrounding Melton's body placed Wilson directly at the scene during the fatal encounter. The autopsy report later presented in court concluded that Melton had died from strangulation, a finding that aligned with the narrative prosecutors would build about the deliberate nature of the attack. Medical examiners explained to the jury that the injuries were consistent with sustained pressure applied to the neck, indicating that the act was neither accidental nor momentary. It required time and physical force, a detail that prosecutors argued demonstrated clear intent. The case surrounding Diane Ruiz unfolded through another layer of forensic evidence and investigative reconstruction. After Melton's death, Wilson left the home driving her vehicle. Inside that same car, investigators later discovered blood belonging to Ruiz, as well as her personal belongings, including her phone. Detectives used this evidence to reconstruct the second killing. According to testimony presented in court, Ruiz had been walking to work during the early morning hours when she encountered Wilson. She was forced into the vehicle and eventually strangled as well. Prosecutors then described the final and most disturbing element of the crime. When Ruiz was still alive after the initial assault, Wilson drove the vehicle over her body. The medical examiner confirmed that the injuries Ruiz suffered were consistent with being run over by a car, a fact that reinforced the prosecution's argument that the act was intentional and carried out with full awareness of the consequences. Investigators also presented statements Wilson made shortly after the crimes. During interviews with detectives and conversations with individuals he contacted after the killings, Wilson described the events with an unsettling emotional distance. Rather than speaking in the language of regret or confusion, his descriptions appeared detached and matter-of-fact. Prosecutors highlighted this tone during the trial, arguing that it reflected not panic, but calculation. They emphasized that Wilson's words suggested someone who viewed the murders not as tragedies, but as actions he had completed. Court records also documented Wilson's behavior after the crimes were committed. He continued moving through the area, using Melton's vehicle and interacting with others without showing signs of distress. Investigators interpreted this as further evidence that the killings were not impulsive acts triggered by sudden conflict. Instead, prosecutors argued that Wilson exercised control over the situation from beginning to end, making a series of decisions that ultimately resulted in the deaths of two people. During the trial, the jury was presented with a wide range of testimony from forensic specialists, detectives, and medical professionals. Each witness added another layer to the timeline prosecutors were constructing. DNA experts explained how genetic evidence connected Wilson to the crime scene. Forensic technicians described the physical evidence recovered from the vehicle. Medical examiners detailed the injuries suffered by both victims, carefully outlining the causes of death for the court. After weeks of testimony, the case moved into deliberation. Jurors reviewed the evidence and the charges before reaching their verdict. In June 2024, the jury returned its decision. Wade Wilson was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Kristine Melton and the first-degree murder of Diane Ruiz. He was also convicted on the additional counts tied to the events surrounding the killings, including vehicle theft and burglary. The verdict confirmed what investigators had argued from the beginning, that the deaths of both women were not accidents or acts of uncontrolled rage, but deliberate choices supported by substantial evidence. The case would soon move into the sentencing phase, where the full consequences of those convictions would be determined. As the case unfolded, news coverage quickly expanded beyond the local boundaries of Cape Coral and began drawing national attention. Early reports focused on the shocking timeline investigators had uncovered, two separate murders committed within hours of each other by the same man. Local television stations in Southwest Florida first broke the details, describing how detectives linked Wade Wilson to both crime scenes through forensic evidence and witness accounts. What initially appeared to be two unrelated tragedies soon became one of the most disturbing criminal investigations the region had seen in years. Journalists followed the story closely as new information emerged from police briefings and court filings. News articles began reconstructing the events of October 7, 2019, carefully piecing together the movements of Wilson throughout the day. Reports explained that Wilson had met Kristine Melton during a night out before eventually going back to her home. When investigators later entered the residence, they discovered the evidence that would form the foundation of the murder charge. Media outlets described how the crime scene revealed a violent struggle, and forensic analysis confirmed that Melton had been strangled. Coverage emphasized the suddenness of the crime and the way it disrupted the quiet sense of safety many residents felt in the community. But the story grew even more disturbing as journalists began reporting on the second victim. Diane Ruiz was widely described in news coverage as a hardworking mother who had been walking to her job early that morning. Interviews with people who knew her painted the picture of a woman devoted to her family and routine. News outlets explained that Ruiz had unknowingly crossed paths with Wilson while he was driving Melton's stolen vehicle. Detectives later determined that she was forced into the car and attacked. The brutality of what followed, particularly the revelation that Ruiz had been run over by the vehicle after the assault, became one of the most shocking details reported during the investigation. As the legal process continued, reporters covered each development from the Lee County Courthouse. Court hearings, evidence presentations, and witness testimony were summarized in daily updates. Coverage often highlighted the emotional contrast inside the courtroom. On one side were the families of the victims, grieving and searching for answers. On the other side sat Wilson, whose demeanor during the proceedings frequently became a topic of discussion in media reports. Journalists noted that he rarely displayed visible emotion while listening to testimony about the crimes. The case gained an additional layer of attention due to Wilson's unusual public image. Photographs taken during his arrest and later appearances in court revealed the distinctive tattoos covering his face and body. Several news outlets reported that Wilson had begun cultivating an online persona while awaiting trial, drawing comparisons from observers who nicknamed him the Deadpool Killer because of the facial tattoos and dark comic imagery. This nickname spread rapidly across social media and headlines, creating a strange mixture of notoriety and fascination that followed the case throughout the trial. Media coverage intensified during the trial itself, particularly when prosecutors presented detailed forensic evidence and testimony from investigators. Local stations broadcast updates each day as jurors listened to experts describe DNA results, crime scene analysis, and the timeline of Wilson's actions. One of the most widely reported moments occurred when testimony revealed that Wilson had spoken about the murders to people shortly after committing them. News organizations described how investigators used those statements alongside physical evidence to strengthen the prosecution's case. When the verdict was finally delivered in 2024, the announcement spread quickly across national headlines. Reports confirmed that the jury had found Wade Wilson guilty on both counts of first-degree murder, as well as the related charges tied to the crimes. Media outlets summarized the significance of the decision, explaining that the case had revealed a chilling pattern of violence carried out within a single day. The coverage also turned attention toward the sentencing phase, where the court would determine whether Wilson would face the most severe penalty available under Florida law. For many readers and viewers following the story through news reports, the case left a lasting impression not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but also because of the unsettling personality that seemed to surround the man responsible. Even as headlines shifted toward the legal outcome, the names of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz remained at the center of the coverage, reminders that behind the courtroom proceedings were two lives whose futures had been abruptly taken away. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a place where the emotional reality behind the evidence finally surfaced. While forensic experts and detectives had already explained how the crimes occurred, the testimony of people who knew Wade Wilson revealed something far more unsettling about his state of mind in the hours after the murders. One of the most powerful moments came when his biological father took the stand and described the phone calls he received from his son on the day of the killings. According to his testimony, the calls began on October 7, 2019. At first, they seemed confusing and strange. Wilson spoke in vague terms, telling his father that he had done something serious. During the early part of the conversation, the words sounded almost unbelievable. His father recalled initially assuming it was just another exaggerated story. But as the conversation continued, the tone shifted. Wilson reportedly admitted that 2 people were gone and would not be coming back. When asked what he meant, he told his father directly that he had killed them. In court, the father described the moment with visible discomfort. He explained that his son had spoken with an unsettling level of excitement rather than fear or regret. The testimony suggested that Wilson wasn't seeking advice or help. Instead, he seemed to be sharing the information almost as if he wanted someone else to feel the same intensity he felt while recounting it. When prosecutors asked about Wilson's demeanor during the call, the father said he appeared energized, even proud of what he was describing. That detail sent a ripple through the courtroom because it contradicted the expectation that someone confessing to murder might sound panicked or remorseful. The father then repeated what Wilson told him about the first killing. According to his statement, Wilson described meeting Kristine Melton earlier that night and eventually going to her home. He admitted that once inside the house, he attacked her and strangled her. The description he gave was direct and disturbing, delivered without hesitation. For the jury listening in the courtroom, the testimony painted a picture not only of the crime itself, but of a man who seemed emotionally detached from the suffering he had caused. The account of Diane Ruiz's death was even more difficult for the courtroom to hear. Wilson told his father that after leaving Melton's home in her car, he encountered Ruiz while she was walking. He explained that he forced her into the vehicle and attacked her as well. When his father repeated the rest of the story in court, the silence in the room reportedly grew heavier. Wilson had said that Ruiz was still alive after the initial assault. Instead of stopping or seeking help, he got back into the car and drove over her. The testimony made clear that the act was deliberate, not accidental. Prosecutors used this conversation to reinforce their argument that Wilson fully understood what he had done. They pointed out that his own father believed the story was real almost immediately because of how calmly it was delivered. The father ultimately contacted authorities, explaining that he feared his son might hurt someone else if he remained free. That decision became a crucial step in the investigation, helping detectives confirm the timeline of events and locate Wilson before further harm could occur. Other witnesses also described Wilson's unusual behavior after the crimes. Investigators testified that during interviews, he spoke about the murders in a detached, almost analytical way. Rather than expressing regret, he described actions and details as though he were explaining a sequence of events from a distance. Detectives noted that he showed very little visible emotion while discussing what had happened. For the families of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, these testimonies were among the most painful parts of the trial. Hearing the final moments of their loved ones described in court forced them to confront the reality of the violence again. Yet those same statements also became some of the most powerful evidence presented to the jury, revealing not just the crimes themselves, but the chilling mindset of the man who carried them out. As the trial moved toward its final phase, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from investigation to consequence. The jury had already heard weeks of testimony detailing the final hours of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, the forensic evidence connecting Wade Wilson to both killings, and the disturbing admissions he made after the crimes. When deliberations concluded, the verdict left little ambiguity. Wilson was found guilty of the first-degree murders of both women, along with the additional charges connected to the events of that day. The legal process had confirmed what investigators had pieced together from the beginning. The deaths were not accidents or misunderstandings, but deliberate acts carried out in sequence within the same day. Following the verdict, the court moved into the sentencing phase, where prosecutors argued that the brutality of the crimes and the lack of remorse justified the most severe punishment allowed under Florida law. They emphasize the calculated nature of the attacks and the fact that 2 separate lives were taken in a matter of hours. The prosecution presented the murders not simply as acts of violence, but as choices made repeatedly throughout the day. Each decision, they argued, demonstrated awareness and control rather than impulse. Defense attorneys attempted to present mitigating factors, referencing Wilson's troubled past, struggles with addiction, and the chaotic life he had lived for years before the crimes. They argued that these circumstances should be considered when determining the final sentence. However, the weight of the evidence and the testimony heard throughout the trial left a strong impression on the jury. After considering both sides, the jury recommended the death penalty, concluding that the severity of the crimes met the threshold required under state law. The judge ultimately accepted that recommendation, sentencing Wade Wilson to death. With that decision, the courtroom chapter of the case came to a close, but the story itself did not end there. Like all death penalty cases in Florida, the sentence triggered an automatic series of appeals that would move through higher courts over the coming years. Wilson was transferred to Florida's death row, where he would remain while the legal system reviewed the case through its mandatory appellate process. While the legal proceedings continued, the focus for many people shifted back to the lives that had been lost. Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz were remembered not for the circumstances of their deaths, but for the lives they had built before that day in 2019. Friends and relatives described Melton as someone who brought warmth and openness to the people around her, someone who believed in welcoming others without suspicion. Ruiz was remembered as a dedicated mother and hard-working woman whose daily routines reflected a commitment to her family and future. In the years following the trial, their families worked to preserve those memories in the face of overwhelming grief. Public statements from relatives emphasized that the victims should never be reduced to footnotes in the story of the man who killed them. Instead, they encouraged people to remember who they were before the headlines, 2 individuals with relationships, responsibilities, and plans that were suddenly cut short. For the community of Cape Coral, the case left a lasting mark. Residents who had followed the investigation closely struggled to reconcile the quiet nature of their city with the severity of what had happened there. The trial had provided answers about how the crimes unfolded, but like many tragic cases, it could not fully explain why they occurred in the first place. Today, Wilson remains on Florida's death row as the legal process continues to unfold. The appeals system ensures that the case will be reviewed repeatedly before any final outcome is reached. Meanwhile, the memory of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz continues to live on through the people who loved them, ensuring that their names remain at the center of a story that began with violence but continues through remembrance. Cases like this force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human behavior. When people search for explanations after a crime of this scale, they often expect to find a single moment where everything broke apart. A sudden loss of control, an emotional explosion, or a clear psychological collapse. But the story surrounding Wade Wilson suggests something different, something quieter, and far more unsettling. The evidence presented throughout the investigation and trial does not point to a man who suddenly lost control. Instead, it points to someone who had slowly disconnected from the emotional responsibilities that come with being part of society. What stands out most in this case is not only the violence itself, but the absence of empathy surrounding it. The testimonies, the statements, and the behavior observed during the investigation all reflected a person who appeared emotionally removed from the consequences of his actions. That kind of detachment can be difficult to comprehend because most people naturally measure their choices against the harm they might cause others. In Wilson's case, that internal boundary seemed either extremely weak or entirely absent. The crimes were not described with regret or confusion, but with distance, almost as if they were events that had simply happened rather than choices that had been made. Another important element revealed by this case is how easily dangerous individuals can blend into ordinary environments. Wilson did not present himself to the world as someone obviously violent. To casual observers, he appeared like many other people drifting through unstable periods of life. He moved through social spaces, conversations, and daily routines without triggering the kind of alarm that might cause others to distance themselves. This highlights a reality that investigators often confront. The most serious threats are not always the loudest or most visibly unstable individuals. Sometimes they are people who quietly withdraw from emotional accountability while continuing to function on the surface. The contrast between Wilson and his victims also carries an important lesson. Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz represented lives built around connection, responsibility, and trust. They were participating fully in the world around them, maintaining relationships and moving forward with ordinary routines. Wilson, on the other hand, had gradually detached himself from those same foundations. His life reflected avoidance rather than commitment, escape rather than responsibility. When those two paths crossed, the result was devastating. What remains significant about this case is not the notoriety surrounding the man who committed the crimes, but the resilience shown by the families and communities affected by them. The legal system reached its conclusion based on evidence and due process, but the emotional aftermath belongs to the people who lost someone they loved. Their efforts to remember the victims as individuals rather than symbols of tragedy serve as a powerful reminder that the true weight of any crime is measured not by headlines or courtroom drama, but by the lives that were taken and the people left behind. Ultimately, the story of Wade Wilson is less about a criminal seeking attention and more about the consequences of unchecked attachment. Violence rarely appears out of nowhere. It often grows slowly in the absence of empathy, accountability, and meaningful connection. Cases like this challenge society to pay closer attention to those quiet warning signs, the gradual withdrawal from responsibility and human connection that can sometimes precede destructive choices. The most lasting legacy of this case should never be the man sitting on death row. It should be the memory of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, two people whose lives mattered long before their names were ever spoken in a courtroom. Their stories remind us that behind every true crime case are real individuals whose futures were stolen and whose impact continues through the people who remember them.